finished with that description of what information you got from that provider?
Not quite, Judge, but almost.
Okay.
I apologize.
Yes.
You can finish.
So she was not going to remain in women and infants, and the next step that she took was hospitalization at MLAN.
And so if I could ask you a follow-up question now before we
Yes.
go on to MLAN
Yes.
about women and infants. Were you able to review the women and infants records?
I was, yes.
And looking at the women and infants records, on page 9 I have here, it states that patient was offered several options for her, including inpatient treatment for medication management, a partial hospital program focused on general mental health, or continued outpatient management. Patient plans to follow up with her outpatient provider for guidance. So even though they said she didn't necessarily fit into their postpartum program, they did offer her 3 other programs, correct?
They did, yes.
And her response, Ms. Clancy's response, was that she was going to discuss that with her provider for guidance, correct?
Yes.
And in reviewing the records of Dr. Tufts and Rebecca Gelada, did you ever see any mention of the defendant actually following through with that and discussing with them those 3 options that were offered by women and infants?
No, what I saw is that they were back to being treated according to the plan and the medication and so on. But she was back to being treated, discussing with Dr. Tufts what the best implications were for treatment.
Okay. And then you were about to talk about what happened at MLAN. So if you could please tell us what you learned about MLAN and how that was impactful to your analysis or your evaluation.
Yes. She was admitted to MLAN on January 1st of 2023. And what got her there was suicidal thinking. That was very difficult for her. That was a very difficult time to experience that sort of thing. And so she went into MLAN on January 1st, and their admission documentation listed postpartum depression and major depressive disorder, which they described as recurrent and mild. While she was in MLAN, what she reported as her primary concern was insomnia. And she said that while she was hospitalized, it actually made her more anxious than being at home. And when she was asked about the suicidal impulses and thoughts, she said that she would not commit suicide because of her children and her mother. So she had they asked about reasons for living, among other things, and those were some of the ones that she cited.
Doctor, would that be called a protective factor?
Yes, sometimes it's called a protective factor.
And that's something that protects you or prevents you from committing suicide?
Yes, would keep you from doing something like that.
Okay. And then what were your further findings?
So she stayed at MLAN for 5 days, and she was documented as not having safety concerns and at minimal risk for returning to the community by January 3rd. She described her mood there as numb, but she denied things like delusions or hallucinations or suicidal thoughts that were continuing or homicidal thinking. And at the time she was discharged on the 5th of January, she was described as cooperative and pleasant, with no psychosis, no suicidal or homicidal thinking. And she said, when I was asking her about it, that when she left MLAN, she had what she described as a small shred of hope after discharge, because she was off of medication, Seroquel, which she thought was causing her a lot of trouble. But the intrusive suicidal thoughts returned, she said, within a week or so following her discharge from MLAN.
And would be moving on now to number 3 on your PowerPoint?
Yes,
The
we are.
Symptoms following the beginning of medication. So what were your major findings in that area?
Well, I have, I think I've combined 2 and 3 as I've talked about this, because one of the things about this is after she started taking the medication in October, the Zoloft, she had, the anxiety didn't get better. She had great difficulty with insomnia. And she said she was numb. She felt like a zombie. It wasn't something that she was able to see any improvement in. In fact, she thought it was getting a lot worse. And so basically, what she thought is that the symptoms that she was experiencing following taking the medication that was prescribed beginning in October, she said the symptoms were getting worse, particularly a new symptom, which was insomnia.
We could move on to the next slide. Doctor, and does that bring us to number 4 on your PowerPoint, the adverse response to medications, including bad insomnia?
Yes, and I won't take nearly as long in talking about that, because one of the things that she thought was happening when she began taking that medication in October is that the medication itself was far from making the anxiety better. It was making it worse and keeping her from sleeping, and it was, she thought, making it difficult for her to she thought that the medication was actually making it a real problem for her to sleep, to feel. She felt emotionally numb and that sort of thing. And so accompanying the bad insomnia with the apparent adverse responses, producing the insomnia and other things, was a real problem for her as she saw it. And it's one of the things that she continued to emphasize to providers, whether it was Dr. Tufts or Ms. Gelada, a nurse practitioner. She said, basically, I think these medications are making me worse. But one of the things, moving on to number 5 there, one of the things she also said is that she was focusing on making the anxiety, helping the anxiety get better through medication. There was a little bit of counseling going on with Ms. Gelada, but one of the things that she did not really have was, say, a cognitive behavioral therapist or something like that to help her work through the problems. She thought that medication was going to try to help, and it really did. It was something that she focused on a good deal.
And when you say she was focused, the defendant was focused on medication resolving her problems, would that include talking to doctors about different medications to try, researching medications on her own, asking friends and family for tips on medications, things like that?
Yes, all of those things.
Okay. And then should we move on to number 6, the mixed evidence about diagnosis and the nature of her problems?
Yes.
And what were your major findings in that area?
Over the course of the time that she was going through these experiences between mid-October and late January, she'd had a lot of providers offer a lot of diagnoses, and there were a lot of complicating considerations. So among some of the diagnoses that she'd been given were adjustment disorder with anxiety and depression, generalized anxiety disorder, major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder 2, postpartum depression, postpartum psychosis, post-traumatic stress disorder. That last one was not before January of 2023, but it's something that she has right now. And in addition to those diagnoses, which sort of implies that she has a disorder and she has symptoms, there were complicating factors. She had psychotropic medication with apparent adverse reaction. She had serious sleep deprivation over a 3-month period. She had between 5 and 8 months after the birth of her third child. She had anxiety about returning to work in the fall of 22. She was worried about leaving her baby for work, and he was not taking the bottle. And the other thing, which was important for her, is she was always someone who was, she was into exercise. And she stopped exercising sometime in October when she started having these adverse reactions. But it's one of these things that it was a real difficult thing for her to handle when she couldn't do the running or the yoga or the Peloton or other things that she used to keep her anxiety managed.
Were you aware that she was able to return to exercising on several dates in December and in January, going to the Kingsbury Club where she was a member?
Yes, she was trying that, yes.
Yeah. And is that something that, as putting on your clinician hat for a moment, is that something that you would recommend to a patient that they, in this situation, that they try to do things like exercise to complement medication and therapy?
Well, if it works, it does work for some people, and they use it effectively over the course of their lives, particularly if they have some anxiety that might not fully need treatment, but it's something that might interfere with your life a little bit.
And what were your next observations?
Well, if we could move on to the next slide, please.
So here we have number 7, your diagnosis, bipolar 2 disorder. So was that your diagnosis of Ms. Clancy?
It was, and it was hard because of all the diagnoses in the records and all the symptoms that she experienced and so on. To make a diagnosis of bipolar disorder or bipolar 2 disorder, which is a kind of a less serious way of experiencing bipolar disorder, you have to have identifiable mood swings, and one is a period of depression, which she certainly had, but a period of depression, and that was something that made a big difference over a certain period of time in depressed symptoms and sadness and not having much or not having much motivation and things like that. But you also, for a bipolar diagnosis, need something where you have an identifiable period where the mood is much greater. It's much. One of the things that I might say is that one feels during a manic period sort of high, jumpy, decreased need for sleep, racing thoughts, sort of flight of ideas, thinking really fast, excessive appetites for different kinds of things, not getting tired, feeling important and powerful, and things like that. And I was having a hard time finding something that looked like it was a manic episode. There were times when she felt, as she described it after the birth of different children, she felt good, she felt on top of the world, she felt really close to them, her husband and her kids, and so on. But it's also something that it didn't look like a manic episode so much as it looked like she was really feeling good and getting back into exercise and things like that. So it's one of those considerations where the thing that sort of gave me pause for a while in diagnosing a bipolar disorder is that I didn't see that manic episode. But what really convinced me is that she's been at Tewksbury now for more than 3.5 years. And the diagnosis of record at Tewksbury is bipolar disorder. And they are, as I read the records, very careful about what they prescribe and how much, and various other kinds of considerations. And one of the things that the records reflect is that when she was on some medication that's prescribed to help stabilize her mood, and it was discontinued for medical reasons, she had a kind of immediate response to that, which is to say, she noticed it, and that's a consideration as well. So I ended up with a diagnosis, making a diagnosis of bipolar II disorder, which is a slightly less, not slightly, it's a less severe form of bipolar disorder.
And doctor, why did you diagnose with bipolar II and not bipolar?
Because bipolar, as I said, is a more severe kind of diagnosis. It's more noticeable, and if you had a bipolar diagnosis, then I would want to see something that clearly and definitely looks like a manic episode. And I did not see any evidence of that before January 24th of 2023.
And there were some incidents that have been described by witnesses who have testified and in the medical records, things like the defendant cleaning out her garage with her husband at one point in time. Was that something that you did or did not see as manic, and why?
Well, there was some indication in the records that some people thought it was manic. I did not see it that way. She did not describe, when I asked her, whether she did not describe that as a manic episode. She didn't think it was. And when I talked to Patrick Clancy, he said he didn't think it was either. And basically it was cleaning out the garage and getting a lot of stuff into 20 trash bags and so on. But one of the things he said is, they were both working hard, but it wasn't all her out there putting stuff in 20 trash bags and he wasn't a part of it. He said he was definitely a part of it.
And would it be accurate that bipolar disorder requires that period of mania for, I believe it's 7 days, where bipolar II requires hypomania for 4 days? Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. And so did you see signs of hypomania?
Well, that's something where it's less clear that it's manic, and that's one of the things that inclined me toward bipolar II is I just did not see signs that were clearly manic episodes, but it looked like something that it possibly could have been a less serious or less severe manic episode.
And in terms of this diagnosis, this bipolar II, is there a way to determine whether she always had this disorder or if it's something new, and if it's something new, when it appeared?
It's a disorder that typically comes on in adulthood. It's not something that you have as a kid or even for the most part as an adolescent. It's something that you start to show the signs of when you are in your 20s or 30s.
Okay. And so at this point, would it be time to move on to number 8 on your PowerPoint?
Yes.
Which would be criminal responsibility evaluation, so mental state and legal standard are relevant. So what were your findings on number 8?
Well, one of the things that I wanted to say about number 8 is that I wasn't called up here just to make a diagnosis or talk about symptoms. This is a criminal responsibility evaluation. And one of the things that I take a look at very carefully when I'm doing something like this is what's the standard for criminal responsibility in the jurisdiction. Now, I'm aware that the court will instruct the jury about the standard and how you apply it and so on, but my understanding of the standard for criminal responsibility in Massachusetts is that a person is not criminally responsible if, at the time of the offense, they suffered from a mental disease or defect, and, as a result, lacked substantial capacity either to appreciate the criminality or wrongfulness of their conduct, or to conform their conduct to the requirements of the law. So there were really three parts. There really are three parts to that criminal responsibility standard. The first is mental disease or defect, and that's one of the reasons why I've paid so much attention to the symptoms and when they began and things like that. But the other thing that I try to do is take those symptoms and see how they affect somebody, in this case Ms. Clancy's, capacity for knowing that something like this was illegal or wrong, or how they affected her capacity for conforming her conduct to the requirements of the law, which I think of as kind of controlling her behavior. And
to determine, is that something that those three elements are those things that you kept in mind throughout your evaluation of the records and your interview of the defendant and the psychological testing that you did?
It is, yes. And it's something that I put on page 1 of my report because I always try to do that to try to make it as clear as I can that this is something I'm paying attention to throughout the entire evaluation.
So that's your mindset when approaching the evaluation of Ms. Clancy?
It is, yes.
Okay. And so what types of psychological testing did you do with Ms. Clancy?
There were several reasons why I wanted to do psychological testing. One is what we call response style. In a matter like this, somebody like Ms. Clancy during an interview could respond what we call reliably, which is within the limits of her memory, as accurately as she possibly can. But there are other response styles. One is that somebody could do what we call exaggeration or even fabrication. Sometimes that's called malingering, which is they distort or they take the kind of report that they do and they exaggerate or even fabricate the severity of what they are experiencing. And then the other kind of response style is to underreport, basically to say, I'm going to minimize or even deny things that I actually experience. So response style is always important in doing a forensic evaluation like this, and I paid attention to it. And one of the psychological tests that I administered, something called the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, has scales that allow me to look and say, is she being kind of reliable, or is she exaggerating or fabricating, or is she minimizing or denying? So that was one of the reasons that I wanted to do these tests. The second is I wanted to pay attention to possible symptoms of what we call severe mental illness, things like hallucinations or delusions or mental disorganization. They can't really kind of focus on what's being discussed so much as you tend to get off track or have tangential speech, which is kind of running off the topic and going to different ways and so on. Cognitive disorganization is another speech. There's also a review of her reported symptoms around January 24th of 2023, and I wanted to ask her questions in a fairly comprehensive way about that. There are other symptoms that she was experiencing reportedly, depression in particular, and I wanted to know how depressed she was feeling. And so that was something that I could also measure with these psychological tests. And then finally, suicidal thinking was quite important. And I wanted to ask her questions about her thinking and feeling and behavior related to suicide kind of leading up to January 24th and then around that time. So these are all reasons why I gave her psychological tests.
Could I have you pause there for a moment?
Yes.
I'm not sure if it's a good time
This is
to
a good
break.
time to break. All right, why don't we do that? Thank you. All right, so members of the jury, we're going to take the afternoon recess at this point. You know my instructions, so they're going to be the same. Don't talk about this case. Don't do any research about this case. Don't listen to anything about it. Don't read anything about it. Have a nice break, and we'll have you come back here about 2 o'clock. Okay?
Court, all rise. All rise, please. Good. Close the notebooks, place them on your chair, just like this.